The night the HOA flooded my field, I stood in the rain watching thousands of gallons of water pour straight onto my land. They thought they had solved their neighborhood's drainage problem. What they didn't realize was that in a few weeks, every basement in their entire subdivision would be underwater. And the worst part? They had no one to blame but themselves. But to understand how this happened, you have to understand two things about my property. First, I own the lowest field in the entire valley. And second, water always finds its way downhill. I bought my farm about 5 years ago. It's not a massive property, but it's peaceful. About 20 acres of open land, a small barn, and one big field that stretches down toward a natural drainage ditch. The place used to belong to an older farmer who retired and moved closer to the city. Most people wouldn't have wanted the land because of the field at the bottom. During heavy storms, that part of the property would get wet. Not flooded exactly, but definitely muddy. The previous owner had explained it clearly. Water from the hills runs through here when it rains, he told me, but it drains out into the creek eventually. And he was right. The field had a natural runoff system that had been there for decades. The water would collect, move through the drainage ditch, and flow into a creek about half a mile away. Simple, natural, and it worked perfectly. For about 4 years, I never had a single issue. Then the development arrived. About 2 miles uphill from my farm, a construction company built a brand new neighborhood called Silver Creek Estates. Nice houses, big lawns, clean sidewalks, and of course an HOA. At first, I barely noticed them. They were far enough away that their traffic and noise didn't reach my property. But the one thing I did notice was the amount of land they cleared. The developers cut down hundreds of trees to build those houses. And when you remove that many trees from a hillside, something important changes. Rainwater stops soaking into the ground. Instead, it runs downhill, fast, straight toward the lowest land in the valley. My field. The first storm after the neighborhood was finished came in early spring. Heavy rain, thunder, one of those storms that lasts all night. Around midnight, I stepped out onto my porch to check the field and immediately noticed something strange. The water level was rising faster than I had ever seen before. Not just a little faster, a lot faster. Within 20 minutes, the lower half of the field was already covered in water. Now, normally, rainwater collects slowly and drains gradually. But this time it was pouring in like someone had turned on a giant faucet upstream. That's when I grabbed my flashlight and drove up the dirt road toward the hill, because something clearly wasn't right. And when I reached the edge of the new neighborhood, I finally saw what was happening. The HOA had installed a brand new storm drainage system. Huge concrete pipes ran from the neighborhood streets down toward the hillside. And guess where those pipes ended? Right above my property line. One massive drainage outlet was blasting rainwater straight down the slope and directly into my field. Thousands of gallons every minute. I just stood there in the rain staring at it. Because the truth was obvious. They hadn't fixed their drainage problem. They had simply redirected it onto my land. The next morning, I drove up to the HOA office. It was a small building near the entrance to Silver Creek Estates. Inside sat a woman behind a desk wearing a badge that read, HOA President, Linda Harper. When I explained the situation, she listened politely. Then she smiled. The kind of smile people use when they think they've already won the argument. Our engineers designed the system to direct runoff into the natural drainage basin, she said. I crossed my arms. You mean my field? She tapped a document on her desk. The valley has always drained that direction. I nodded slowly. Yes, naturally. But your pipes are dumping 10 times more water into it. She shrugged. It's within county regulations. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. If your field floods, that's a private property issue. Translation? Not their problem. I left the office that morning frustrated, but not angry. Not yet, because at that point I thought it was just bad planning. A mistake. Something the county might force them to fix. But I was about to learn something important about HOAs. Sometimes they don't fix mistakes. They double down on them. And a few weeks later, they would. After my meeting with the HOA president, I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe their engineers really believed the system would work. Maybe they thought the natural drainage ditch in my field could handle the extra water. But the next storm proved something very important. They were wrong. 2 weeks later, another heavy rainstorm rolled through the valley. This time I was ready. Before the rain even started, I walked down to the lower field to check the drainage ditch. Normally, it was about 3 feet wide and maybe a foot deep. just enough to carry runoff toward the creek. But now, the ditch had already widened. The first storm had eroded the banks badly. Loose soil had collapsed into the channel, making the water flow unevenly. I knew what that meant. If the next storm sent even more water down that pipe, the ditch wouldn't hold. It would overflow, and when it overflowed, the water wouldn't just stay in my field. It would spread everywhere. The rain started just after sunset. At first it was steady but manageable. Then around 9 p.m., the sky opened up. Within minutes, the sound of rushing water filled the valley. I grabbed a flashlight and drove up toward the hillside again. The drainage pipe the HOA had installed was blasting water like a fire hose. It was louder this time, stronger, and the water coming out wasn't just rain. It was everything from their streets. Mud, leaves, debris. All of it was shooting down the hill and tearing through my field like a river. I watched the ditch for about 10 minutes before it finally happened. The bank collapsed. Water burst over the sides and spread across the grass. My lower pasture was underwater within half an hour. Luckily, it wasn't near the barn or the house, but the damage to the soil was obvious. The runoff had carved deep trenches across the field. If it kept happening, that land would become unusable. The next morning, I went back to the HOA office. This time I brought pictures, lots of them, photos of the pipe, photos of the flooding, photos of the erosion across my land. Linda was sitting behind the same desk when I walked in. I laid the pictures down in front of her. "You see this?" I said. She barely glanced at them. "Yes, your drainage system caused it." She leaned back in her chair. "Our engineers approved the design. That ditch can't handle the volume of water you're sending down there." She folded her arms. "Well, it's functioning as intended." I stared at her for a moment. "Your pipe turned my field into a river." She shrugged. "Again, that's not our responsibility." Then she said something that still amazes me. "If your property has drainage issues, you should consider installing better runoff management." In other words, they expected me to fix the problem they created. That afternoon, I called the county office. I filed a complaint with the environmental department. A week later, an inspector came out to take a look. He walked the hillside, examined the drainage pipe, measured the ditch on my property. Then he scratched his head. "This system might technically meet minimum code," he said, "but it's definitely pushing the limits." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means if something fails upstream, there's going to be a lot of water coming down here." He pointed toward the neighborhood on the hill. "And if that ditch can't carry it," I finished the sentence for him, "it'll back up." He nodded slowly. "Exactly. Back up." That night, I studied the layout of the neighborhood. The storm drains in Silver Creek Estates all connected to that single outlet pipe above my field. Every street, every gutter, every driveway, all the rainwater from the entire development flowed through one point. And if that outlet ever got blocked or overwhelmed, the water wouldn't reach my field. It would stay in the neighborhood, right under their streets, right around their houses, and eventually inside their basements. I didn't plan anything at that point. I didn't touch their drainage system. I didn't interfere with their pipes. I simply watched the weather forecast. Because spring storms in this valley are unpredictable, and when the next big storm arrived, Silver Creek Estates was about to learn something important about water. It always finds the lowest point, and if you redirect it the wrong way, eventually it comes back. About 3 weeks later, the forecast finally showed what I had been expecting. A massive spring storm system was moving through the valley. The Weather Channel predicted over 4 inches of rain in less than 24 hours. For most places, that would just mean puddles and wet roads. But in a hillside neighborhood where every street drains into a single pipe, that much rain can become a serious problem, especially when the drainage system is already under pressure. The rain started early in the morning. At first it was light, but by noon it had turned into a steady downpour. By mid-afternoon, the entire sky looked like one giant gray cloud. Water was running down every slope in the valley. I drove up the hill again just to see how the HOA system was handling it. The pipe above my field was already roaring. The water blasting out of it looked like a small waterfall, but something else caught my attention. The drainage ditch in my field had widened again. The erosion from the previous storms had changed the way water flowed through it. Instead of forming one narrow channel, the water now spread across a wider area before reaching the creek. Ironically, that change made the ditch more stable. The water now had more space to spread out, which meant the ditch could actually handle more flow than before. In other words, my field was slowly adapting to the extra water. But the neighborhood uphill, that was another story. Around 6 in the evening, the rain intensified. Thunder shook the valley. Sheets of water ran down the streets of Silver Creek Estates. Every gutter and storm drain was working at full capacity. All that water rushed through the underground pipes toward the main outlet above my land. But that's when the real problem appeared. A large pile of debris had collected inside the outlet pipe. Leaves, branches, trash washed down from the streets. Normally, smaller storms would push debris through the system gradually. But with this much rain hitting all at once, the blockage started building up quickly. Water still flowed through the pipe, but not fast enough. And when storm drains slow down, the water has nowhere else to go. At first, the residents noticed water pooling along the curbs. Then the street drain started overflowing. Soon the water was spreading across driveways and lawns. By 7 o'clock, parts of the neighborhood looked like shallow rivers. I was standing near the hillside watching the outlet pipe when I heard sirens in the distance. A police cruiser drove slowly through the neighborhood streets. Then another. Apparently residents had started calling for help, but the police couldn't stop rainwater. An hour later my phone buzzed. It was the county inspector who had visited my property earlier. "Have you seen the neighborhood?" he asked. "I'm looking at it right now," I said. He sighed. "The drainage system is backing up. That's what you warned them about." "Yes." There was a long pause on the phone. Then he said something that told me just how serious things were becoming. "We're already getting reports of water entering basements." By nightfall, the entire situation had turned chaotic. Emergency crews were driving through Silver Creek Estates, trying to direct traffic away from flooded streets. Water continued pouring into the storm drains faster than the blocked outlet pipe could release it. And when the system reached its limit, the water found new paths. Down stairwells, through basement windows, under garage doors, inside dozens of homes. The next morning, the rain finally stopped. The storm clouds drifted away, leaving the valley quiet again. But the neighborhood on the hill looked very different. Punks were running outside multiple houses. Wet furniture sat on driveways. Carpets hung over railings to dry. Several residents stood outside talking angrily with county officials. And right near the entrance of the neighborhood, I saw Linda, the HOA president. She was speaking with the inspector when I pulled up. As soon as she noticed me, her expression tightened. The inspector waved me over. "Well," he said calmly, "looks like the drainage system didn't handle the storm." Linda looked furious. "This isn't our fault," she snapped. The inspector raised an eyebrow. "Your system directs the entire neighborhood's runoff through one outlet. That's standard engineering." He nodded slowly. "Not when it overwhelms surrounding land and creates a blockage risk." She pointed toward my field. "If his ditch had better drainage." The inspector cut her off. "His ditch carried the water just fine." He then gestured toward the flooded neighborhood. "The problem is upstream." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the residents standing nearby said something quietly. "So the flooding happened because of the drainage system?" The inspector nodded. "Yes." "And the HOA installed that system?" Another nod. The resident looked directly at Linda. "Well, that explains a lot." Over the next few weeks, engineers and county officials inspected the entire drainage layout. Their conclusion was simple. The HOA system had concentrated too much runoff into a single outlet. When debris partially blocked that outlet during a heavy storm, the water backed up into the neighborhood. Exactly what the inspector had warned about. Exactly what I had tried to explain. In the end, the HOA had to spend a huge amount of money redesigning their drainage infrastructure. They installed multiple runoff channels, additional overflow drains, and a much larger outlet pipe farther down the hillside. This time, they routed the water around my field instead of through it. I didn't celebrate when their basements flooded. Honestly, I would have preferred if they had fixed the problem earlier. But sometimes people only listen after consequences appear. The valley eventually returned to normal. My field recovered. Grass grew back where the water had carved trenches. And the creek carried runoff away just like it always had. Nature had its balance again. As for Silver Creek Estates, their HOA meetings apparently became a lot more interesting after that storm, because every homeowner there learned a very expensive lesson. Water doesn't care about paperwork. It doesn't care about HOA rules. And if you try to redirect it without understanding how nature works, eventually, it comes back to remind you.